All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked, and we're stoked to have you with us once again. On behalf of Tony and Phil, I'm Matt Farlow, and we are continuing our step into faith-seeking understanding. In the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about the truth of power and the power of truth, and the willingness for the church to will itself, or maybe even commandeer the idea of will, so that when we pray thy will be done, actually the will being done is our own human will as opposed to God's will. And so we've been stepping into this conversation, and today we want to continue this push into the church. In this The topic today is American Idol, the church and her trophy. What is it that is at the center, the heart of the church? Power has been the train of our last a couple of weeks, and we want to continue this with, well, what happens though when power actually becomes something that the church strives after? I still remember, a couple of weeks ago when you, Tony, said, I've never done drugs, but power in and of itself, you get that taste of when people literally wait on every word, every ounce of sound, movement that you do, and it's enticing, it's intoxicating. And it's where, George Orwell has this saying in Animal Farm, but then is played out also in 1984, is the idea of the corruption of power. So what then of the idols, the American idols of the church? Do we look more towards people, or movements? And we talked a little bit about this a couple weeks ago when you brought up, Phil, the idea of the push for racial reconciliation. We have to be careful though that that's not what the only thing that the church becomes a part of. If the church just becomes nothing more than a voice for people to voice their protest for the need for understanding Black Lives Matter, then the church loses its profundity of the wholeness, right? The holistic gospel. So then what is it that the American church idolizes today? Does it have a proper idol? Or what are the objects of worship that we sell out to? Numbers, sexiness, edginess, edgy missional trips. So those kind of things. And I don't know where you're both at, but for me personally, my concern has always been too, where we get into the kind of like the runoff or the overflow of the mega church days, where it was about personality, vibrant personality. We were talking last week about Eric Metaxas, and he could easily slip into the new Mars Hill, right? Mark Driscoll was this bigger than life personality, thought he could just do whatever he want, and was a real jerk off, according to some of the elders and those that were at his church. Nothing different though. Metaxas believes it's okay for him to step up and pop a protester when Jesus's commands to love the other are clearly not to be abusive. When someone hits you, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. When they ask you to go a mile, you go two. So I just feel as if it plays into the continued worship of a person other than Jesus, something other than Jesus. And I don't know how you've seen that play out, but we see it play out too with politics, right? And this idea of whoever has more power has the bigger voice, and that's who the church connects with. And I don't know if it's ever been any different. I don't know if it's like we're entering in a new time, but it seems as though the evangelical church, as it pushed further and further away from the Reformation days, it's gotten more and more into it becoming its own idol, its own worship. It worships itself. And so like it's this self-defeating kind of self-eating, the Ouroboros, where it eats itself, it's eating on its tongue. And so the church wonders why the numbers continue to sort of decrease. And yet you're like, but why would we want a human institution pointing to itself and telling us this is the abundant life, when we could do that on our own without any of these guilt and shame aspects that come out from the church? What is it that the church worships today? Is it Jesus? I don't know.
Yeah,
Thoughts?
I'll jump in on thinking in terms of just the notion of power that you brought up, and in my brain, my initially thought humility, and just the fact that it just doesn't seem, especially in light of, you brought up a couple of leaders, and then kind of just think through time, the idea of a named leader, a personality, a person that's charismatic, being kind of at the front of the church, and this person not necessarily being a humble person. This is the person's there ideally because they have personality. They're attractive in the sense of their charismatic and how they speak and really just in that regard. Um, Take into account as well, the three of us pastors, or me, former pastor, two current pastors. Um, it is very intoxicating being people, talk to them every single week, and in many ways, them leaning on a lot of what you say or every single word that you say, and then just having that. You almost have the impression that you can say anything, and those guys will be with you. And you have to be careful as to who you're actually following and staying under the Holy Spirit as you're doing that and being kind of broken in that regard. So it's number one, very intoxicating, but we're used to being humble. We're not used to, especially now in light of just being a leader. A leader is usually, as we would understand leadership, it's not connected to someone who's going to be humble. Paralleled, look at the very opposite of it. So that the whole notion of trying to be humble, trying to live a humble life, and trying to be a leader in America at that time, those two things. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who the American Evangelical Church believes it worships. I mean, at face value, the American Evangelical Church says it worships Jesus, but I guess the evangelical question is always which Jesus, because evangelicals always pose that question to Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, Roman Catholics, you name it, they'll always say, what Jesus? And I think, yeah, I mean, even just today, just before us getting on together, there's news that another evangelical pastor, charismatic is in Pentecostal evangelical pastor, just said, "Man, there needs to be another civil war because the first civil war, the work of heaven wasn't finished, and for us today in our current time, the Black Lives Matter movement is the new KKK. And so we need a new civil war to fight against left-wing activists and the Black Lives Matter movement." And for me, the irony of that is, well, who are the descendants of the KKK, like Ku Klux Klan members today, like attacking? They're attacking Black Lives Matter activists and protesters. So if David Duke is saying that Black Lives Matter is abhorrent, which side do we want to find ourselves on? And if evangelical pastors continually back the people who have white supremacist platforms, who have KKK platforms, but then they accuse a different group of being racist, that leads me to question, which Jesus do white evangelicals worship? And man, like even with news today, Southern Baptists want to drop the Southern from Southern Baptist and just be Baptist. I'm like, sure, you can drop the Southern, but can you take the Southern out of you? Like, you guys became a denomination because you wanted to uphold slavery. Your views of inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture is a product of your desire to uphold slavery. I think it leads us back to how you opened the conversation, Matt. It really is power. And yes, militarism, money, and racism cannot be divorced from one another. Those three things are so deeply interwoven and entangled. And so when we confront the ailments of the church today, the American Evangelical Church, when we talk about what plagues the American Evangelical Church, I don't think we can pull punches or try to like speak softly and nicely, because these aren't nice issues. Southern hospitality is a reason why we're here. And so we continue to say, man, we need to be nice and kind and peaceful. Whatever that means, I don't know. All I know is that from what I've seen, all that amounts to is that we keep the status quo. Black brothers and sisters continually uh, are murdered and scapegoated. And Jesus isn't glorified. Like, the power of Jesus is found in his weakness, in his meekness, in the crucifixion. And the power I see from white American evangelicals is instigation. It's the, yeah, I don't see a weakness, because there's not a desire to be weakness, and that's what power does. It seduces. Um, and so, yeah, for me, sitting where I'm sitting, it's easy to be on a high horse and find my own moral high ground. But my hope and prayer is that as I'm in community, as I call out what I see toxic in American evangelicalism, that the brothers and sisters that I surround myself with also call out what's toxic in me. And so that I'm learning submission. And like you said, Phil, I'm learning humility, not humility in abstract of, oh, okay, I'm working on being humble, but humility in community where people are actually calling me to the carpet and to the floor. But with, American evangelicalism, I think for far too long we've tried to pull our punches for the sake of being nice or wanting the microphone to be passed to us.
And at the same token, with your saying, Tony, part of this is connected to the notion that I don't think we've seen outside of the scriptures kind of strength enacted through humility, through weakness. We're seeing strength enacted through standing on top or on the backs of others. So we're used to power being driven about in that way. So to then call them, just how you said, people are striving for the microphone to be given in their direction. If you're working with the poor, you don't need a microphone. You're just working with the poor because this is what you do. But yeah, and that becomes the message. And I've battled a lot just looking at, just thinking of, church meetings and the like. I went to an in-person church gathering this past Sunday. There was, we're in a 100 or 200 person facility, and there's 30 of us, and we're spread apart, all wearing masks, kind of thing. And I was sitting in there thinking, is this the best kind of expression of the gospel? This is what we're all striving for, is to get together in a room, sing songs, hear the word. That's all good. And it was great. It was great. But at the same token, I'm wondering, is there a way that we can be the message? And instead of having all the energy poured into sitting and doing these things that we assign Christians, that if we were doing the work with people that have lost their income, that have lost food, lost beds, and we turn, just change all those signs and actually pour into, what does it look like to be Jesus? Where would he be right now? Because I don't think he would be locked in a building with a bunch of guys singing and praising. They would be on the front lines working with people and actually showing God's love in that way. And that would be the message, and we wouldn't care about a microphone, because who wants a microphone when you're working in that way?
Yeah, it's interesting too. Because I agree with you, Phil. I think that it's interesting how the church today is willing to put itself getting together, even if it's only 30 people in a close place, you're still putting yourself in harm's way. And it's interesting how instead of going, like you're saying, and allowing Sunday to be the time right now in COVID-19, where instead of maybe getting together and singing songs about Jesus, which is great, part of the time would be to actually go into the place where the homeless are, and to live that out. But that doesn't fit into our well-ordered structure of how we have church, because the more you stretch people and so this is where one of the idols I think we have in the church that's an unspoken idol and that we worship is comfort. um, we don't want to disrupt our own comfort zones, and so we have these safe spaces. Tony, you were talking about how when we come in, it's not to ruffle feathers, and even like what you're saying, Phil, it's great that you could have a rousing message on Sunday with the 30 of you, but shouldn't it be already within us that to get fired up, we're getting fired up to go and actually live amongst, serve, even in the light of COVID-19? This is where I think the consistency of who we worship plays out in what we do with our time, right? And it's interesting. I don't know where the church's outcry is, even with the Breonna Taylor thing. I saw that today. They came about, still no charges, but they paid a significant amount of money, as if to say, look, and it's really ironic because maybe it's just sad, because I wish that the family would be able to say to this state, no, we don't want your money, because the church has stepped in and poured out these millions upon the Taylor family and said, no, we're not taking your money in order to take a stand with the people behind us, the people who say they love Jesus, because they're taking care of us financially. We're not going to take your money, because we're going to take a stand right here and now to say the way in which you're treating Black and brown brothers and sisters is unacceptable anymore. And this is where I think that the white culture, the white evangelical church, is letting down the people who have been severely oppressed and beaten down by our societal structures. But in order to combat that, we have to step into this system that all of us have been brainwashed through years, hundreds of years, and so even though the right is coming out with these extreme, oh, the leftists are trying to do this, the left is still doing the same to the right when it comes to political and saying, oh, the collusion of Russia, the David Dukes and the white supremacy absolutely runs rampant. But what they're doing is they're just trying to highlight the not so good of the other side so that we don't get focused on the not so good of their own party policies, right? The Democrats are not absent of the ways in which they oppress people as well, right? Their own purity tests fall apart just as much as the Republicans do. And we see this glaring chasm that's been created within the human condition because the church's absence, because the church is so played. It is not biblical to go out in front of a church and just simply hold up a sign, a Bible, all the while claiming that God is love, when you just use the fire hose to spray out and crush people, and then you have these evangelical leaders walking alongside Trump by saying nothing. They weren't there physically, but they're there spiritually when they're not condemning those acts, but then also the left, they do the same thing with their commandeering. Where's Buttigieg? He was so high in on his the high and unholy of, hey, Christianity, the Republicans don't have take on this, just on this hold of religion. And yet, where is he today? Calling out the indiscretions of the religious. I don't see where he, like, once he stepped out of the presidential race, what now all of a sudden it's not that important because religion doesn't matter. And so then the church, though, allows them to get away with that. And so, like you were saying, Tony, sometimes in a group I was meeting with last night, because we're trying to do this work through racial reconciliation, even within our church here in Northern California. And one of my things is I believe that from the pulpit, it has to come about with what Jesus did in the temples. Every now and then you have to grab each of us by the scruff of our neck and say, dude, you're not living the Christian life. Your Christianity that you purport to could be inauthentic because we're not seeing the fruits. And the response was, whoa, we have to be gentle with each, which true. Shrewd as a serpent, gentle as a dove, but gosh darn it, to continue to say, oh, well, give this is racial reconciliation. The whites we have to give them space because they've been brought up in this white culture, the white evangelical church they haven't seen. No, that's horse manuki, that's manure. Like that's because it's giving the excuse to just go slow. We don't know that tomorrow is going to come. the slower we are. How do we not know that we're actually keeping ourselves out of heaven because we're then saying to the Lord, no, no, it's not immediate. The power in which we idolize, that the will in which we idolize is the one that allows me to still keep my comfort while giving lip service to these things such as racial injustice, such as homelessness, such as poverty. Tony, it's no surprise that you brought up those three that were crucial to Dr. King, right? The militaristic, the poverty, the economic strife, and the racial strife since day one from the garden, right? That was the expel because they started to see people as things right then and there, and it just eventually will lead into the racial injustice. It will lead into the militaristic mindset. We are nationalistic. We are very self-focused. You're part of this tribe. I'm part of this tribe. And it will lead into then the oppression of people based on finances. The church still seems to be perpetuating that. Question is what have happened to the voices of the past, the voices of the Bonhoeffers, the voices of the Dorothy Days, the voices of, the Paul Tillich's Brueggemann you brought up, the voices of Cohn, the voices of Cornel West, where are those voices? Is it just that they're not able to speak, or are some of the voices that want to speak out still in a little bit of trepidation going, And I'm not saying that their comfort and they're living in their comfort, but could it possibly be too, though, that people who should be speaking out are still even too comfortable in their own right mind to where they're like, ooh, I don't want to rock the boat too much. I don't know, because I'm wondering what is the reason why we haven't spoken out more about this? What power is holding us down as the church? Is it us ourselves, sin? And how does that affect me, affect you, Tony, affect Phil? Or is it just simply an unwillingness to truly live the gospel message as proclaimed and lived out by Jesus?
Yeah. With American Christianity, I would say that when it came to the United States, it was very much, and still is, a white man's religion. Now, race, I'm using that as a theological and sociological category. I'm not using that as a ethnic category or a biological category. I believe race to be a social construct. So I'm using that not as a ontological category. And so within America, I think where we find ourselves today is that because for so long the call of unity was actually a call to whiteness, what we're finding ourselves now is in a moment of reformation. I think for Protestants, we've always experienced schisms. We've always experienced a protest. But for so long, a call to unity has been a call to whiteness, a call to submission, a call to assimilation. Now, for the first time in history, from what we see from the polls and the outcries, there's never been a time in the history of the United States where there has been an anti-racist majority. I think within the history of our country, there's never been a time where we have seen the majority of Americans be anti-racist, not just not being racist, because you can not be racist but still opt into racial prejudice and racial microaggressions. You can still participate in the system as somebody who's not racist by just being passive and abdicate. But for the first time in the history of our nation, we see that there's a anti-racist majority, that there are communities all across this country working towards not just racial reconciliation, but working towards the dismantling of a racial system. And so what we see now is that white evangelicals will not back that. They will not join the anti-racist majority because for them, they're too busy being a part of other majorities, the silent majority, the moral majority. Like the card is checked already on the majorities. So now they want to be the minority, you know? But maybe they're the minority on the wrong side. And so this isn't me trying to fear monger. This isn't me trying to like whistle blow or cry wolf. But I think I'm hopeful. I am excited for the future of the church in the United States, because if the church is unwilling, if a church is unwilling to participate in the work of dismantling racism, and that church dies, Jesus, take the wheel. Like, grace and peace to you. Go and be with the Lord. Like, heaven is your home, and you're just a pilgrim passing through. And the pilgrims have been passing through for the last 400 years. It's time for you to go. Like, I mean, and this isn't me wishing ill on any church. This is just me saying, man, this is a reality we're living in where Black and brown brothers and sisters are dying. And if we will not participate in protecting their lives, being pro-life, not just pro-life, but anti-murder, then I think we have nothing to say in regards to the gospel. If our theology and our worship of Jesus does not produce in us a weightiness that weighs on our conscience, where we are in positions to determine life and death, and if that does not weigh on us, and if we do not feel the implications of that, and it's just an afterthought, and all we care about is the potential of life in the womb, we have very little to say. And so I am hopeful. And I'm not hopeful as a pastor. I'm not hopeful as a youth leader. I'm hopeful as a follower of Jesus, seeing how he is raising up leaders. And I mean, not to continually beat on Sean Foyt, because yes, we would love to have a conversation with you, brother. But like, Sean came in a couple of months ago and he said he was turning riots into revivals. We just passed 100 days of protests a couple of weeks ago. I don't see any revivals. Like, the only revival I see is the brothers and sisters who are still on the streets, day in and day out. I don't see the revival that Sean was talking about, because all the evangelical brothers and sisters that I'm in relationships with are like, man, we're still waiting for God to send revival. Like, we need to hunker down. And I'm like, dude, there's some jubilee going on with the protests. It's the time of year where the slaves are being set free, where there is reparations. That's the movement I want to throw my weight behind. And so, yeah, I want to shed the adjectives of evangelical, of leftist, conservative, liberal, and I want to faithfully follow Jesus. And where I see his spirit moving is, man, in the streets where people are calling out for justice. And the thing is, it's not self-serving. I think that's what I've been trying to put to words. It's like, I don't think anybody enjoys getting like tear gas every night. I don't think like these people enjoy getting clobbered and beaten with clubs. There's nothing self-serving about that.
Right.
And so I can only judge a movement by its intentions, and I don't see how you can say that's a self-serving movement. Maybe we've all lost brain cells because of the tear gas. I'll give you that.
Or the cloud. Yeah, well, I just think too with Sean and with the other folks, I totally agree with you, Tony. And it's not even, I feel like when people critique the church or with faith, there's a conglomerate of folks that say, no, we shouldn't do that. But those tend to be, if you look at the voice that say no, are the ones that are in leadership. Because again, and this is where even for me, and I know that to say that we need to have more of a movement, it's got to be jarring. And I know that, see, some would say, oh, well, in order for that to happen, especially if, if your skin is darker than mine, it's easy for you to say, hey, you look at me and say, but we've been trying, you need to step up and do it. Absolutely. But it's also part of my saying in that I can't put the onus on, yes, I think the white evangelical church has an absolute responsibility to do this, but it cannot lead the way in the sense of, ooh, we're going to step in and take care of this, because again, then it's perpetuating the same kind of crap that's happened throughout the history, where the white person in control steps in and says, oh, hold on, let me don my Superman cape and show you, what the way is to correct this, because then it's just a correction of the same systemic evil that we've all been poured into throughout the hundreds of years. And look, I applaud the framers of this country. I applaud their willingness and their desire to step out of the tyranny and the authority of the British rule, for the willingness to say we want religious freedom. We want these freedoms for the individual. What bums me out, though, is the same thing that happened to the humans of the 1700s is the same thing that happened to the humans of the first century, or even before, the 100 years before Christ, where they choose themselves, though, over, and they believe that the tree of good and evil and the knowledge of good and evil is planted by them so that it's able to be eaten by them whenever they want. And it totally takes, and again, we talked about this last week, the Christian church today has not wrestled with the truth of God's death, killed at by the hands of each one of us, And so I think this authority, in some senses, the power of the church has played out in the one who seemingly is the most abrasive, the most aggressive, and the most obnoxious. And for some reason, we think that that's characteristics of leadership. And so when we talk, like Phil was talking earlier, and Tony, you picked up on it, the idea of humility, we respond somewhat like, we should respond like Nietzsche in disgust of the church saying that humility and servanthood is the truth, and yet we live out the reality of power and authority. And so for Nietzsche, he was disgusted at that and said, look, I think that the only Christian that ever lived was this Jesus character who was humble, who was weak, who was, in light of all the worldly stuff, and you elevated him to the point of killing him. You didn't elevate him to the point of worshiping him. And I think that still happens today, is we love Jesus enough to elevate him to the point of, now the decision is put in front of us. Do we elevate him to the point of worship, or do we elevate him once again to the point of the cross and nail him to that? And I think we see that playing out in today's culture,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And hopefully Phil can jump back in before we close.
Stuff, so yeah, I agree.
Uh, I think I think for all that we've been blessed with in the American church, like, following Jesus isn't complicated. It's hard. Like, and I don't think that should be a mind-blowing statement.
Yeah.
But it has become a mind-blowing statement. It's become a controversial statement, because then you have, ivory tower theologians that want to pontificate, and they'll say, oh no, like, you have to have your theology in order. But I really wonder why Jesus, never said in the Greek that, like, he was the eschatological ground, like the ontology of all ontologies. Like, he just doesn't make it complicated. He says, love your God and love the neighbor as yourself. And so I think for us, we've made it complicated with power. And so, yeah, I'm encouraged, because I see people divesting in power. That's what I see with the Black Lives Matter movement. And that's what I see with the protests. It's not people, it's everybody who is marching on the streets is somebody who is divesting their power.
Yes, and they're willing to give it to the other person and say, actually, look, and this is the thing with the group mentality. There is goodness within the group setting. Okay. There's also the tension too of losing yourself to the group, and I think that's what's happened. What we see, and this is where I know it gets some of the folks whenever we start talking about racial injustice and bring up Dr. King, and any of my white friends in the church or whatever, they roll their eyes or whatever. I almost just want to go to and say, I don't know how you think you're a Christian if you continue to question why we're stepping into racial injustice is not a topic or an idea that we have to deal with. It is the reality of the church that must be confronted. It's not a thing, it is a reality. See, when we objectify it so much so, then racism can just be put up on the shelf with all of our other objects of irritation that we say within the church. It's not a reality of how we act, so we don't deal with it from a relational, very intentional, very tangible way. We just deal with it in ideology. It's bad, check it off as bad, good, we're okay with that. And so I think that until the church really embraces the truth of her own darkness, in the daily killing of Jesus by denying the truth of climate change, denying the truth of oppression based on economics, denying the truth of racism, denying the truth of our militaristic, nationalistic tendencies. Until we confront those, we're never going to be able to truly live out, love the Lord your God with all your heart, because we still see not neighbor, we see enemy. You're stopping me from getting what I want, right? So I think it is not simple, and it's not complicated. It is hard. It is tumultuous terrain in which we are called to traverse, right? It is Jesus saying, hey dudes, they persecuted me, and look how and then that's a foreshadow of the full persecution of the hanging on the cross. And he says, they will do this to you, right? So this ethos of suffering, there has to be an ethos of suffering to bring about joy. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. How many Christians are willing to endure this crappiness of suffering and sacrifice? It's hard. It is hard. But the joy that comes from that in seeing the elevation of the other, of our black and brown brothers and sisters, of our gay and poor, of our left out, but the ones that have been left behind by the church. That's the scary part, right? The eschatological vision, in some sense, has been carried out by the church with the purging of the other by us just simply leaving them out. They're not good enough. We're going to continue this talk. We totally appreciate Phil joining us. He's he's serving, and so he's at a place now where the internet is a little bit shoddy, and so this is why I love Phil, man. The guy just is nonstop with this. He's an inspiration to me and to Tony as well, and so that's where his internet is. He's in the city, right, living it out. We are both in our comforts of our own home, so our internet. But we appreciate Phil. He's going to be back next week with us, where we're going to continue to get into this, because we've been talking about power, we've been talking about worship. We're going to continue what we worship, and we're going to throw that third element in that everyone loves to talk about, and it's money, the economy and stuff, because like Tony was bringing up, militaristic, financial, economic, and racial. These are the three pillars that the church must step into. And just because Tony, Phil, and I are ones who don't shy away from what we're not supposed to talk about, we're going to step in and talk about politics and money and nationalism, right? So next week, we're going to continue on that track. For those of you that have joined us this time, we totally appreciate it. Be sure to share this with your friends, these YouTube videos. Hit subscribe right there below on one of the corners of the video. Also, anchor.fm for those of you that might have internet issues, always available on our podcast, New Wine Cast, the New Wine listening experience, New Wine tastings, New Wine Uncorked, New Wine table talks. Every Thursday we go live, 1 o'clock Pacific time on Facebook right now, where you can interact through the comments actually right there live. Otherwise, you can throw your comments down below, because Tony and I and Phil are fully on board with interacting with each one of you. Go to new-wineskins.org. Sign up for our newsletter, because in October, the end of October, I believe it's like 23rd, 24th, or 24th, 25th, we're doing a new wine retreat via Zoom. It's open for every single one of us, no matter where you're at in the world today. You can join us for that retreat. And so we'll have more information coming. Go to our Facebook page and like that so you can be updated with all these notifications. Thanks for joining the three of us while Phil was on. We'll see you next week with another edition, another episode of New Wine Uncorked. Until then, I'm Matt. That's Tony. That was Phil. Thanks for joining us, Phil. Next week, we'll see you on the flip side.